You wake not because you are restored, but because consciousness has resumed its task. The body has ceased its brief withdrawal, and the mind, obedient and unasked, returns to awareness. There is no sense of arrival in this moment, no feeling of beginning. It is more accurate to say that something unfinished has simply continued. The fatigue you notice upon waking is not the fatigue of exertion. It is not the kind that follows effort or struggle, and it does not promise recovery. It is older than the day that has just begun. It has no clear origin, and therefore no clear remedy. It is the tiredness of being present again. Nothing is particularly wrong when you open your eyes. The room is as it was. The world has not shifted in the night. There has been no catastrophe to explain the heaviness that greets you, and yet the weight is there, immediate and unmistakable, as though consciousness itself carries a cost that sleep only postpones. You notice how quickly the mind begins to register obligation, not urgency, not fear, but the simple fact of having to pass through another sequence of hours. This recognition does not arrive with protest. It arrives quietly, with the dull precision of something long familiar. You have done this before. You will do it again. That knowledge alone is enough to exhaust. There is a particular kind of weariness that comes not from suffering, but from continuity. Pain, at least, has edges. It announces itself. It demands response. What weighs on you now is smoother than that, less dramatic, and therefore harder to name. It is the burden of duration. You do not wake with anticipation, nor do you wake with dread. Those require a degree of emotional investment that has already thinned. What you experience instead is a neutral reluctance, a hesitation without argument. Existence resumes, and you do not object, but neither do you consent. The body moves because it must. The habits of living perform themselves with little involvement from thought. You sit up, you stand, you prepare for the day in the same way one prepares for weather that cannot be altered. There is no complaint in this, only an absence of expectation. Desire used to provide a reason for mornings, even when it disappointed you. It at least suggested that something lay ahead. Now it has lost its voice. It no longer persuades. It no longer promises. What remains is the structure of wanting without its heat, the form of appetite emptied of conviction. You may remember when effort felt justified by the possibility of relief. Work led to rest. Striving led to reward. Even disappointment had a kind of energy, because it implied that things might have been otherwise. That implication has weakened. You no longer feel cheated. You feel informed. The world presents itself without invitation. It does not ask whether you are ready. It does not adjust its pace to your condition. Time moves forward, indifferent to the quality of your engagement with it. This indifference is not hostile. It is simply complete. You begin to notice that rest itself has changed. Sleep no longer feels like restoration. It feels like suspension. Consciousness shuts down not to renew itself, but to escape its own weight for a few hours. When it returns, it brings back exactly what was set aside, unchanged. There is a clarity in this that is easy to overlook. Nothing has been taken from you. No essential promise has been broken. What has occurred is that illusion has thinned to the point where it can no longer sustain momentum. You see more accurately now, and that accuracy is tiring. The idea that life should feel otherwise has quietly dissolved, not in anger, not in grief, but in a gradual adjustment of expectation. You no longer wait for a turning point. You do not imagine a version of yourself for whom this wait would be surprising. It belongs to the condition itself. This is why encouragement sounds hollow when it reaches you. It speaks from a misunderstanding, from a belief that effort naturally tends toward fulfillment. You have observed otherwise. You have noticed the pattern repeat itself often enough to recognize its shape. Striving produces movement, not resolution. The heaviness you carry is not dramatic enough to attract sympathy. It does not interrupt your ability to function. You continue to speak when spoken to. You continue to fulfill roles. From the outside, nothing appears to be failing. That is precisely what makes the fatigue difficult to explain. You are not overwhelmed. You are not broken. You are simply awake to the texture of things as they are when stripped of unnecessary expectation. This awareness does not elevate you. It does not grant authority. It only removes certain illusions that once made the effort feel lighter. As the day unfolds, you notice how quickly distraction loses its effect. Sounds, tasks, conversations pass through you without leaving much behind. They fill time, but they do not shape it. When they end, you are left with the same quiet pressure you carried before they began. Pleasure, when it appears, is brief and oddly distant. It does not sink in. It does not gather momentum. It arrives, passes, and leaves no residue strong enough to justify anticipation. You do not resent this. You simply register it. The way one notes a change in temperature. The mind becomes economical under these conditions. It no longer reaches outward unnecessarily. It no longer invents futures to sustain itself. Thought narrows to what is required to proceed. There is a restraint in this, not chosen, but acquired through repetition. You may notice that even reflection has become quieter. There is less internal commentary, less need to narrate your own condition. Words feel excessive. Explanations feel redundant. What you live with is already fully present to you, and naming it adds nothing. The body carries this knowledge without protest. Movements slow slightly, not from weakness, but from an instinctive conservation of energy. There is no rush. There is no sense of being late for anything essential. Time stretches, not expansively, but thinly, like a surface worn smooth. You begin to understand why the morning feels heavier than the night. Sleep, for all its limitations, at least suspends awareness. Waking restores the full weight of perception, along with the recognition that nothing has shifted in your absence. The same conditions resume, intact. This is not despair. Despair requires a lost object, a hope that has been actively destroyed. What you experience now is quieter than that. It is the absence of a demand that things improve, replaced by a steady acquaintance with how they persist. There is dignity in this state, though it does not announce itself as such. It is the dignity of not asking more from existence than it has ever been inclined to give. It does not comfort. It does not console. It simply allows you to stand without self-deception. As the hours pass, you feel the familiar pull toward evening, not because you expect rest, but because consciousness will again loosen its grip. Night offers no solution, only interruption. Even that has its value. To be unconscious is, for a time, to be spared the effort of seeing. And so the day proceeds, not as a journey toward something, but as a continuation of what was already underway before you opened your eyes, a sequence of moments that require attention but do not invite belief, carrying you forward not because you choose it, but because motion itself has not yet exhausted its claim on you, and awareness, having returned, remains in place, observing without argument, without hope of interruption, and without any particular reason to expect that the next waking will feel any lighter than this one, since the condition that greets you in the morning is not produced by the night, but belongs to consciousness itself, and therefore accompanies it wherever it goes, including into the next thought, which begins to form even now as you notice how this recognition settles, not with drama, but with a steady, unadorned pressure that continues as long as you remain aware, and perhaps longer still, as awareness itself continues to assert itself without asking whether it is welcome. As awareness settles into the day, you notice how little resistance remains. There is no fight left in you against what must be done. Resistance requires energy, and energy now feels too precious to spend on protest. You comply not because you agree, but because refusal would demand more than you can offer. Time no longer feels like a sequence of opportunities. It feels like a surface you move across, steadily and without variation. Morning, afternoon, evening, these are no longer stages with distinct meanings, but different shades of the same persistence. Each hour passes not because it matters, but because it cannot do otherwise. What once felt like motivation has thinned into routine. You do what is required because it is required, not because it leads anywhere. The idea that effort should culminate in satisfaction has quietly withdrawn. In its place is a simpler understanding. Action maintains continuity, nothing more. You begin to sense how deeply desire has exhausted itself, not in dramatic renunciation, not in bitterness, but in silence. It no longer rises to suggest alternatives. It no longer invents futures worth leaning toward. It has learned, through repetition, the limits of its own influence. This absence is often mistaken for emptiness, but emptiness implies loss, a space where something should be. What you experience now is not a lack, but a completion of expectation. Desire has finished saying what it had to say, and nothing has replaced it. The world does not respond differently to this shift. It continues to present itself with the same neutrality as before. Objects remain available, people continue to speak, events unfold. The difference lies only in your relation to them, which has become thinner, less invested. You notice how conversations move around you without truly entering. Words are exchanged, but they do not accumulate meaning. They pass through awareness like sounds heard from another room, registering briefly, then fading without consequence. This is not detachment as a strategy, it is detachment as a condition. Memory, 2. changes its character. The past no longer glows with nostalgia, nor does it sting with regret. It appears flat, like a series of completed actions whose emotional charge has dissipated. You remember what happened, but not why it once felt important. The future offers even less, not because it threatens you, but because it no longer persuades. Plans appear as outlines without substance. Possibilities feel weightless. You do not fear what is coming. You simply do not lean toward it. This is why hope feels exhausting now. It asks you to invest energy in images that have already failed to sustain you. It requires belief in a structure of reward that no longer convinces. To refuse hope is not to embrace despair. It is to conserve what remains. Boredom begins to reveal its deeper form. It is not the absence of stimulation, but the exposure of repetition. Everything begins to resemble everything else. Differences remain, but they no longer justify excitement. Variety exists, but it does not alter the underlying pattern. You see how quickly satisfaction collapses into neutrality. Even when something goes as intended, the feeling it produces is brief and shallow. It does not anchor itself. It does not echo. It fades almost immediately, leaving behind the same baseline of quiet endurance. The body registers this with a subtle heaviness, not pain, not illness, but a constant sense of carrying itself. Muscles move without complaint, yet without enthusiasm. Each action feels slightly heavier than necessary, as though gravity has increased by a small, unmeasurable amount. You do not dramatize this sensation. You do not speak of it unless asked. And even then, words fail to capture it accurately. Language tends to exaggerate, to search for meaning. What you live with now resists interpretation. It simply is. Social life continues around you, but it feels increasingly ceremonial. Roles are performed. Expectations are met. Interactions follow their familiar scripts. You participate without believing in them, much as one follows customs whose origins have long been forgotten. This does not make you cynical. Cynicism still implies engagement, still feeds on disappointment. What you experience now is quieter than that. It is a form of resignation that has shed its bitterness. Things are as they are, and you no longer argue. You begin to recognize how clarity itself carries weight. To see without illusion is not liberating in the way it is often described. It removes certain forms of suffering, but it also removes momentum. Without distortion, nothing appears urgent enough to justify intensity. The mind adjusts to this by becoming sparse. Thoughts shorten. Explanations lose their appeal. You no longer rehearse arguments with yourself about how things should be. You have seen enough to know how little such rehearsals change. Silence grows more frequent, not because you seek it, but because there is less to say. Inner narration thins. The constant commentary that once accompanied experience begins to quiet, as though it, too, has grown tired of repeating itself. You notice how endurance replaces intention. You do not decide to continue. Continuation happens. Each moment follows the last, with mechanical reliability. You remain present, not out of commitment, but because presence has not yet released you. This endurance is not heroic. It does not feel noble. It does not invite admiration. It is simply what remains when other motivations have dissolved. To endure is not to overcome. It is to persist without expectation of improvement. There is a particular honesty in this state. You no longer pretend that effort guarantees meaning. You no longer inflate small pleasures into promises. You allow experiences to be exactly what they are. No more, no less. And this accuracy, though heavy, is at least stable. As evening approaches, you feel the familiar softening of attention. Fatigue deepens, not dramatically, but steadily. The mind loosens its grip, thoughts slow, perception dulls slightly. This is not relief, but it is a reduction. You do not rush towards sleep with hope. You approach it with neutrality. Sleep will not repair what you carry, but it will suspend it. For a few hours, the obligation to be aware will pause, and that pause, however incomplete, is enough. You lie down not with gratitude, but without resistance. The body settles, consciousness thins. The day does not conclude so much as it fades, leaving behind no summary, no lesson, only the quiet certainty that what resumes in the morning will resemble what has just ended, because nothing in this cycle has ever suggested otherwise. And as awareness begins to dim, you sense not an ending, but another interval in the same unbroken sequence, carrying forward the same condition under a different light, waiting only for the moment when perception will again return, unannounced, to continue observing what has not changed, and what does not need to, as long as existence itself continues to insist on being noticed, which it will, as it always has, until the next awakening brings you back into that noticing, where the same quiet wait will already be waiting, unchanged, and ready to be born again, without commentary, without protest, and without any expectation that it should feel otherwise. When consciousness returns again, as it always does, there is no surprise in the reunion. Familiarity has replaced curiosity. You recognize the sensation immediately, not as something new, but as something uninterrupted. Waking is no longer an event. It is merely the resumption of observation. By now, you understand that clarity has altered your relationship with time. Days no longer appear as containers for possibility. They stretch forward as identical units, each sufficient unto itself, none carrying more significance than the last. The future no longer gathers momentum. It waits, inert. This is where boredom settles in, not as restlessness, but as exposure. There is nothing missing. There is simply nothing concealed. Repetition reveals itself as the dominant structure of experience, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. Variety does not dissolve it. Change only rearranges its surface. You notice how often others mistake this recognition for depression. They assume sorrow must be present when enthusiasm disappears. But sorrow requires attachment, and attachment has already loosened its grip. What remains is flatter than sadness, quieter than grief. You are not grieving a lost dream. You are standing in the absence of dreaming itself. The mind no longer projects itself forward in search of compensation. It remains closer to what is immediately given, and what is given is limited, finite, and insufficient to sustain excitement. This is why activity no longer redeems the hours. You can fill them, occupy them, structure them carefully, and still feel their weight unchanged. Movement does not negate duration. It merely carries you through it. The body senses this before thought does. Fatigue settles not in the muscles alone, but in posture, in breath, in the way attention sags, even when nothing strenuous is demanded of it. You are not tired because you have done too much. You are tired because you are awake again. Clarity strips effort of its illusions. You see how little difference most actions make beyond maintaining the sequence. This does not render action meaningless in a dramatic sense. It renders it sufficient only for continuation. Life sustains itself, nothing more. You no longer mistake this for injustice. There is no sense that something has been unfairly withheld. Existence was never obligated to provide fulfillment. That expectation belonged to a misunderstanding you have outgrown. Social obligations now appear as negotiated pauses in solitude rather than sources of connection. You engage because disengagement would complicate things unnecessarily. You speak because silence, in certain contexts, would require explanation. The exchange itself no longer carries expectation. Even emotion has simplified. Peaks and valleys flatten into a narrower range. You still register pleasure and discomfort, but neither dominates. Both are temporary disturbances on a steady baseline of endurance. They come and go without altering the underlying tone. This is where resignation takes on its true shape. It is not surrender to suffering. It is the cessation of argument. You no longer debate with reality. You no longer propose alternatives. You accept the terms not because you approve of them, but because refusal has proven ineffective. The mind becomes more economical with interpretation. You stop asking what experiences mean. Meaning implied direction, culmination, arrival. What you observe instead is persistence without destination. Events follow one another without progressing toward resolution. There is a strange steadiness in this recognition, not comfort, but reliability. Illusions were volatile. They lifted you briefly, then dropped you. What remains now does neither. It stays. You begin to see how endurance replaces both hope and despair. Hope demanded improvement. Despair protested its absence. Endurance asks nothing. It neither celebrates nor condemns. It simply continues. This continuation does not feel brave. It does not feel chosen. It feels automatic, like breathing or aging. You do not congratulate yourself for it. You merely notice that it happens. Silence deepens as explanations lose urgency. The inner voice that once commented, judged, anticipated, gradually withdraws, not because you force it to stop, but because it has exhausted its material. There is nothing new to add. Moments begin to pass without narration. You experience them directly, without translating them into stories about yourself. This reduces suffering, but it also reduces intensity. What remains is bare perception. You notice how even questions thin out. Why things are this way no longer troubles you. How long they will remain so does not concern you either. The mind rests in the recognition that neither answer alters the condition of being present. Time becomes less dramatic when stripped of expectation. It no longer rushes or drags. It simply accumulates. Days stack quietly, indistinguishable except by memory's bookkeeping. This is why the thought of tomorrow feels neither hopeful nor threatening. It feels inevitable. Another interval will present itself, asking to be inhabited, and you will inhabit it, because inhabiting is what occurs when awareness persists. There is no bitterness in this understanding. Bitterness still resists. You have moved beyond resistance. What remains is a quiet accuracy that does not soften itself for comfort. As this accuracy settles, you find that even the desire to escape dulls. Escape implies an elsewhere worth reaching. That implication has weakened. You no longer imagine a version of life that would justify longing. What remains is not peace, but equilibrium. Not balance in the sense of harmony, but in the sense of forces that no longer struggle against one another. Desire has loosened, illusion has thinned, endurance has taken their place. And so you continue. Not because you believe in continuation, but because nothing within you demands its opposite anymore. And this absence of demand, this quiet suspension of wanting, allows existence to proceed without friction, carrying you forward through the next hour, and the next, with a steadiness that no longer asks for interpretation. Only presence, which remains, observing, thinly and precisely. as the weight you carry becomes less something you notice and more something you inhabit, inseparable from the awareness that holds it, and which continues now into the next stretch of time, where even this recognition begins to feel familiar enough to fade into the background, leaving behind only the simple fact of being here, still and still awake. There is no moment when this condition announces itself as complete. It does not arrive with finality. It simply persists, gradually blending into the background of perception until it becomes difficult to distinguish where awareness ends and weight begins. They appear together now, inseparable. You no longer search for language to describe this state. Words once felt necessary, as though naming the experience might loosen its grip. Now they feel redundant. What you live with does not require articulation to be known. It is already fully present. Others may still speak to you of purpose, of renewal, of hidden meaning waiting to be uncovered. Their voices reach you, but they do not penetrate. You hear them as one hears weather forecasts while standing in the rain, aware that the description changes nothing about what is already occurring. This does not provoke irritation. Irritation would imply expectation. You understand now that most speech is an attempt to soften what cannot be altered. Having relinquished that attempt, you listen without engaging, allowing words to pass without resistance or adoption. What remains is a quiet steadiness that does not call itself peace. Peace suggests resolution, a settling of accounts. This is something thinner than that. It is the absence of internal dispute, not the presence of satisfaction. You continue to perform the gestures of living. You rise, you move, you respond. These actions no longer feel connected to a narrative of becoming. They are simply the mechanics of existing while aware. Nothing more is required of them. At times, you notice a faint surprise that you are still here, not relief, not gratitude, but a neutral acknowledgement. Continuation has occurred again, without justification, without ceremony. It has happened before. It will likely happen again. You do not frame this as courage. Courage implies opposition, a challenge met and overcome. What you experience now contains no such drama. It is closer to gravity than to resolve. A steady downward pull that does not intensify, but also does not release. Memory grows quieter as well. The past no longer presses forward, demanding recognition. It rests where it is, complete and irrelevant. You do not revisit it often, because there is nothing left to extract. The present, too, loses its urgency. Moments arrive and depart without insisting on interpretation. You observe them, then release them, not deliberately, but naturally. As one releases breath without instruction, you begin to understand that endurance is not an achievement. It does not elevate you above others. It does not mark you as exceptional. It is simply the condition under which most lives proceed once illusion has thinned enough to stop interfering. This understanding does not isolate you, but it does quiet you. You no longer feel compelled to explain yourself, because explanation assumes a listener who expects something different. You no longer expect that. Even suffering, when it appears, fits into this pattern. It hurts, and then it passes or dulls, leaving behind the same baseline of awareness. It does not teach. It does not redeem. It merely occurs. You do not conclude from this that life is cruel. Cruelty implies intent. What you observe instead is indifference, vast and impersonal, neither hostile nor kind. Existence unfolds without reference to your preferences. There is a certain dignity in standing within this recognition without seeking compensation. You do not demand that the world justify itself. You do not ask that awareness be made easier. You allow things to be exactly what they have revealed themselves to be. As time continues, you notice how little this stance requires from you. No belief must be maintained. No hope must be protected. No despair must be resisted. You are relieved, not by improvement, but by the cessation of inner negotiation. You remain present, not because presence offers reward, but because absence has not arrived. This is not a choice you renew. It is simply the ongoing fact of being conscious while time continues to pass. And so the weight does not lift, but it also does not demand explanation anymore. It is carried without commentary, without the expectation that it should feel lighter tomorrow, or heavier, or different at all. And in this unadorned continuity, you stand exactly where you are, seen without distortion, neither rescued nor condemned, simply enduring within the clear, unsentimental knowledge of what it means to exist while awake, and to wake again, and again, as long as waking continues, without resolution, without promise, and without any final word waiting beyond this one.